All right, joining me on today's program is G. Edward Griffin. He's a writer and an author, in fact, of a very popular book that's entitled The Creature from Jekyll Island, a second look at the Federal Reserve. Ed is also a documentary film producer with many successful titles to his credit, and he has become well known for his gift of researching difficult topics and presenting them in clear terms that all can understand. Ed, it's great to have you back on Follow the Money Weekly Radio.
Well, thanks, Jerry. Thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. Great to have you back. Ed, the U.S. economy has been on life support over the last few years thanks to the efforts of the Federal Reserve to continue priming the pump. And here we are in the middle of July, just 2 weeks after the official end of QE2. And now this week, we are hearing that the Fed appears ready to provide even more accommodative monetary policies if needed. So my question is, what do you make of the fact that Bernanke and company are already talking about a form of QE3 so soon after the end of the controversial QE2?
Well, the only thing that surprises me, Jerry, is that anybody is surprised at it. The fact that he's proposing the expansion of the money supply is completely in keeping with his promises when he was first nominated to become chairman of the Federal Reserve.
Right.
If you remember, they called him Helicopter Bernanke,
right.
Because he said, well, we'll just create the money as much as we need and drop it from helicopters if we need to do that. And people forgot that because that's exactly what he has been doing. And in fact, that's the only trick that the Federal Reserve System knows how to do. Whether it's Bernanke or somebody else, doesn't make any difference. I think people forget the fact that the chairman of the Federal Reserve System doesn't really make policy. He is the executive, and he follows the directions of those who control the Federal Reserve System. And who are they? Well, they're the large member banks. And I use this just as an aside to say something that I never get tired of repeating because people need to hear it, and that is that the Federal Reserve System is a banking cartel. And so if you realize what it really is, it's not a government agency. If you really understand and internalize the fact that the Federal Reserve System is a banking cartel, it's no different than an oil cartel or a banana cartel or a sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. Then you realize that the executive head of the banking cartel takes his instructions from the banks who comprise the cartel. He's just the figurehead. He's just the guy that carries out the directives of his employers. So the whole purpose of the Federal Reserve System is to promote the best interest of the banks.
Mm-hmm.
And all the banks know how to do, and the thing that's in their best interest is to expand the money supply, because every time they do that, that new money goes into the economy in the form of loans. That's how money gets into the economy. The banks loan it into the economy, which means they're collecting interest on it. So if you realize that all of this quantitative easing, and like they like to call it, they give it these names so that you can't really figure out what the heck they're talking about. They're really talking about more bank loans being pushed into the economy at the level of billions or trillions of dollars. Bank loans. That means bank interest. Now you begin to get a picture of what is really going on. If you expect the banks, the Federal Reserve System is the banks, if you expect them to do anything other than make loans, you're expecting something that will never be. So I'm surprised only that other people are surprised that Bernanke is talking about more loans again, because that's all he can talk about.
It's their only incentive, isn't it?
It's the only incentive they have. It's the only trick they know, and it's all they will ever give us as long as we allow them to run the show.
Wow. When will we ever learn, Ed? It's one of these things where it's just you begin to... old George Santayana, who once said, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it, and it seems that's exactly where we are.
That's it exactly. If we don't know what's going on in the past, we don't know what's going on now, and it'll just happen over and over again because those who do know what's going on, it's to their advantage to keep us in the dark.
Well, one of the common reasons that are given in support of the existence of the Federal Reserve and its policy is that it serves to, quote-unquote, stabilize the economy. and that without the intervention of the Fed, the financial markets would, in essence, run amok. What's your response to that?
Well, I say let's give the Fed a report card. If you send a kid to school and you say the objective here now is to teach this kid how to read and write and do some mathematics, know something about geography, and get good grades and all of that sort of thing. And if, at the end of the period, you give him an exam and he comes up with failing marks on all of these levels, you would say that the school system has failed or that the student has failed. Well, if the purpose of the Federal Reserve System is to stabilize the economy, then how good a job has it done? The economy has exploded. It's falling apart. People are out of work. Inflation is rampant. Productivity is down. Everybody's worried about, are we even going to survive in the months ahead? And I would say that the Federal Reserve System gets a failing mark on its report card for stabilizing the economy. But I go even further and say that the reason that is not true, I'm going to argue against it now, is that has never been the primary objective of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has never had the objective of stabilizing the economy. That's what they say they're trying to do. That's how they sell it. That's how people put up with it. They think, well, these are good people, all right? These are good men. They're trying their best to do what's best for America and for the economy and for the working man, and so therefore they tolerate all of this. But if they understood, as I said a moment ago, that the Federal Reserve is a banking cartel, and that the purpose of the banking cartel is the same as any cartel, which is to promote the interests of the members of the cartel, that means if they understood that the purpose of the Federal Reserve is to promote the interest of the banks, not to stabilize the economy, then you would say that the Federal Reserve gets an A on its report card, because that is exactly what it's done over the years. The banks have done exceedingly well. They have milked the taxpayers. Every time they get into trouble, there's a bailout costing the taxpayers billions, if not trillions of dollars. It all goes into the banks, directly or indirectly. And so when you really understand the true purpose of the Federal Reserve, then I would say it would give them an A on the report card, because the true purpose is to milk the taxpayers and benefit the banks.
Well, the newsmakers this week have the nation's attention focused on the raging debate taking place out in Washington over whether or not to raise the current debt ceiling. And so this week we have on full display Washington's complete inability to govern. And on top of that, we also have stories coming out about the two major credit rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, that are claiming that they are both on the verge of stripping the U.S. of its AAA credit rating. Now, you and I both know there's a lot of political theater happening in Washington, but what are some of the important takeaways from this debt ceiling debate that we're hearing so much about, Ed?
Oh gosh, a lot of thoughts just went flooding through my mind in that last 10 seconds there. First of all, I think about these credit rating agencies threatening to downgrade the credit rating of the United States government. My gosh, they should have done that 30 years ago. I mean, if I'd been running a credit agency, the United States government would have been at the bottom of the list. The only reason they've been able to get away with the fraudulent accounting that they've been doing, much worse than Enron accounting, is because they can force the world to accept their funny money. The American dollar has been the reserve currency of the world. Why? Well, at first, in the old days, it was because it was a strong currency. And then eventually that was not true, but people were still accepting it because they knew if they didn't, they'd send the Marines in. And there'd be, all of a sudden the country would be declared as a home of terrorism or something like that, and they'd be invaded. So the dollar's been really supported primarily by the military threat. Well, now even that is fading, and so the dollar is falling apart the way everybody who really understood these issues knew it would at least 30 years ago. I'm not the only one that started writing about it in those days. So these credit agencies just discredit themselves when they say, well, we're thinking about downgrading the credit rating of the United States government. Maybe we'll do it and maybe we'll not. So that was the first thought that popped through my mind. But So the rest of that, though, let's see. We were talking about what was the rest of your question? I get hung up on these credit agencies. I get so mad at that charade.
Oh, it's unreal. Well, mainly the thing is this debt ceiling debate. That's,
the debt ceiling.
That's just been constantly been ad nauseum in the news cycle. What do you think the main takeaway from that is? What should Americans understand about that?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to understand about the debt ceiling is that there is no such thing. There is no such thing as a debt ceiling and never has been. The so-called debt ceiling laws that they pass are just temporary numbers that the Congress sets. Okay, for now, the debt ceiling is such and such, and that's an absolute ceiling, they say. Absolute ceiling. We can't spend any more of that and then that, unless, of course, we decide we want to. In which case, we'll change the debt ceiling. So if you can move the debt ceiling up or down, there is no such thing as an absolute ceiling. It's just an arbitrary number that they set from time to time. Mm-hmm. So the word ceiling is very deceptive. It just merely means what's their target date. I mean, their target number, I should say. So, yes, and they're going to raise it unless they adopt some measure like the Ron Paul proposal, which is to simply cancel the debt that is owed to the Federal Reserve System, most of which will be repaid to the Treasury anyway, because that's what the Fed does on all of the interest it collects in excess of its operating expenses. I think that's a good measure, by the way, but it's not a fix. It's just a temporary solution. In the long run, let's just forget about what they're going to do for the next few months. In the long run, the guys that are making the decisions in Washington today are the same guys, basically, that have been making the decisions for the last 30 years. The same, collectivist mentality, the same cabal partnership between the politicians and the banks. Nothing of that has changed. The label Republican has changed to Democrat and then back to Republican and then back to Democrat. Those labels have changed, but the underlying philosophy, the ideology of both of those camps has not changed. So since nothing has changed, we know, it's not guesswork, we know that they're going to raise the debt ceiling, so-called, and continue to expand the money supply, because that's what they have to do. They're not going to try and cut expenses, because that would be unpopular. These guys wouldn't be voted into office if they cut benefits, so-called benefits. They're cutting benefits, of course, through inflation. I mean, they can vote higher benefits here and there. They can give you inflation adjustments, and they can even increase Social Security a little bit. But inflation is eating away at all of that at a rate much greater than the growth. In other words, if you increase something by 3%, by raising the numbers, but then decrease it by 20% because of inflation, you're actually losing ground. But unfortunately, the average taxpayer doesn't understand that. He just thinks he got a 3% pay raise, and that the inflationary aspect to it, well, that's something that's not controlled by mere mortal men. It's something that just happens by an accident of nature or something like that. And so the average citizen who doesn't understand these mechanisms is easily fooled. And so the politicians know that. They play it to the hilt, and they'll continue to expand the money supply, raise the debt ceiling, continue to spend, and all of that is paid for eventually by the citizen through increased prices for bread and gasoline and rent, education. And the end of that process, if you follow it all the way to the end, is the total destruction of America.
My guest today is G. Edward Griffin. The book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. On page 509, I want to read a quote. You write, "There are more people working for government than for all manufacturing companies in the private sector. There are more bank regulators than bankers. There are more Farm Bureau workers than farmers, more welfare administrators than recipients. There are more citizens receiving government checks than there are paying income taxes." And then you continue on page 510, and you say the political function of the food stamp program is not to help the hungry, but to buy votes. Then you go on one final statement here that I want to discuss. You make the comment about how these entitlements and the interest on the national debt are simply just destroying the budget is basically our budget is morphing into basically paying for entitlements and interest on the national debt. You comment on page 510, even if Congress were to stop all of the spending programs in the normal budget, dismantle the armed forces, close down all of its agencies and bureaus, stop all of its subsidies, and board up all of its buildings, including the White House, it would be able to reduce its present spending only by 1/3. That is simply astonishing that all the debate we see in Washington right now is really over pennies compared to the real problem that we have in this nation.
Yeah, that's true. And unfortunately, the people who are benefiting from all of that are not going to talk about the real problem. They'll talk about little things that require Band-Aids, but not that require surgery. So that's the problem. As I said before, that it's out of control. It's really past the point of repair. The damage is done. There's no way to avoid it. That doesn't mean we can't recover, but what it does mean is that we can't recover without paying one terrible price. It's like I think a good analogy would be it's like an alcoholic who has gone full course. He's got the DTs now. He sees white elephants floating around on the ceiling. He got the shivers and shakes. He can't stand. His vision is blurred. All of these things, and he's almost on the verge of death. And somebody comes along and says, "Well, how are you going to fix this guy?" And the doctor says, "Well, let's give him a shot of whiskey." This is what they're doing now. They're giving this sickly patient, our economy, the same medicine. They call it medicine, but it was the same drug that put the patient on the verge of death in the first place, which is this expansion of the money supply and incredibly expanding debt. So you just look at it, and here's this patient. This patient might die, but at best, if he recovers, he's got to go through one heck of a recovery period. He's got to detox.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to be pleasant. So I'm simply saying my message is those Pollyannas who want to say, well, what can we do without paying a price? There is nothing we can do now without paying the price. There has to be a price paid now. And it's just a question of the sooner we get started with it, the less severe it will be. And if we don't get started pretty soon, we may not be able to save the patient at all.
Yeah, it's a tough message, Ed. It's been one of the most difficult things that we've been saying and trying to help Americans understand for the last several years is that America is insolvent. America's a bankrupt nation, and our national bankruptcy is a direct result of the violation of the basic monetary principles that are found both in the Bible when it talks about unjust weights and balances, false weights and balances, and also, ironically, even in the document that this nation claims as its guide, the United States Constitution. So we've dishonored crystal clear warnings from the past, and in so doing, we are corrupting our future, as you pointed out. And in your book, you point this out as well, The Creature from Jekyll Island. You make these points painstakingly clear. It makes me wonder, Ed, because you know people like this, and I do too, who sit on the edge of their seat watching the political debates, and they believe in their minds firmly that if we could just get this particular person into office, or if we could just get this particular party, dominating the city of Washington, that somehow all of this could be changed. But the way that you paint this picture, and the way I think both of us believe, is that this thing is lock, stock, and barrel. The globalists control this thing. Am I right?
Absolutely correct. Yeah, this has very little, if anything, to do with individual personalities. The political leaders that grace the front page of our newspapers are pretty much dispensable characters. They're like actors on the stage. I mean, if you have a major play in Broadway, and especially if it's a musical, you have understudies. So in case the lead actor is sick or gets killed, you can go on the next day with his replacement. Mm-hmm. And he's almost indistinguishable from the original. Mm-hmm. And so that's what happens in politics. We have these people who are put up as candidates for political office, but they're dispensable. If something happens to them, if they get sick or they get old or they fall into disfavor, or they get caught in a scandal, or whatever happens, their political party goes into disfavor and they're replaced by somebody else, doesn't make any difference. They're just figureheads. They're actors on the stage, and they read their lines and follow the plot of the play. And I know that probably sounds pretty extreme to some people, but it's certainly my conviction after studying this for a long time. I don't think that any of the so-called major political players in the world are really their own people. I think that they're put up by very powerful forces behind the scenes, and they pretty much follow the script that's given to them.
And so when Americans get angry, at particular politicians or whatever, it's really part and parcel of the design. It's actually a good thing for the globalists because it keeps the attention off of them, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And in fact, this has been worked out and theorized very carefully. There was a professor of history by the name of Carroll Quigley, who's deceased now, but he's written several interesting books. He was a professor at Georgetown University. Right. And he was William Clinton's teacher when Clinton was a student there, and became very close to Clinton. And well, that's another story. But anyway, the point I'm driving at, I know we have limited time, is that Professor Quigley wrote a couple of books, and one of them was called Tragedy and Hope. And in that book, Quigley is talking about, he's a historian, remember, and he's writing the history of the world's largest secret society. And it's the one that Quigley says really runs the Western world today. And the society doesn't really have a name because they chose not to have a name, because that would add to their ability to remain secret. They decided that if they chose a name and used a name, well, then people could talk about it. And so one of their conscious decisions was not to have a name. And even Quigley refers to it at various points in his book as the group or the association and so forth. But the secret society was created by Cecil Rhodes and the tremendous wealth that he had. And the reason I'm mentioning all of this is because Quigley, in his book, says he admires this group. He's not really a member of it, but he's their historian. And he says, quote, I was allowed for several years to study their private files and papers. And he was allowed into the inner circle. And then he says, I have no aversion to it at all. He says, my only objection to this group is that they choose to remain secret. And he felt that they deserved to get some credit for what they were doing, running the world. Well, having said all that, now he finally comes to a place in his book where he says, how is it possible for us, and he's referring now to this group and more or less himself on the sidelines, how is it possible for the elites of the world to run the world and at the same time allow the citizens the illusion that they are determining their own political destiny? People live in democracies now. They have a vote. They select their leaders. They determine their own political destiny, or so they insist on thinking. They demand that right. So the question is, how do you let people have the vote and yet make sure that you make the decisions and not them? And he answers the question. He says, well, it's very simple. All you have to do is have two major political parties, let them fight it out between the two, but we control them both. There you have it.
Wow.
That's what's been going on in the United States since at least the turn of the last century. It all started in full force under the Wilson administration. And yet, the American people, and myself included, until I really got deep into this, we knew nothing at all about this. And that's how secret societies work.
Well, I'm sure that's a mind bender for some of our listeners. We've painted a pretty dark, dismal picture of where the society at large seems to be heading. Based on all your research, based on everything that you've studied, what hope or what kind of suggestions can you offer people to help them, number one, wake up from what's happening right now, and number two, what practical things can they do? What can they put into practice in their own lives that may help them thrive in this environment?
Excellent questions, and that really cuts to the core. There are only two things that we need to focus on. One is to make sure that our information is correct. In other words, to become informed. Well, we hear that all the time. Read another book. Go to a lecture, all this sort of thing. It's necessary. For most of us, when we started down this path, we needed a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And so if any of your listeners are new to this, I would say don't skip over this step, because there are so many elements of deception out there, so many myths that need to be exposed, that if you start to take action without really understanding what's going on, you're going to be easily defeated. In fact, you may even wind up working against yourself. You'll be tricked into working against your own best interests. So, yes, if anybody wants to learn as much as possible on a quick schedule, I would urge them to come to our website. We created a place just for that. It's our commercial site where we have books and recordings, and that's called The Reality Zone. So we have about 100 different items there, and you can spend a lot of time reading and looking at videos and listening to recordings, all of which we think are very essential for a real understanding of what's going on in the world. So the first thing is, yes, become informed. Go to realityzone.com and take a look at what we have there. But then what? Okay, if we don't do anything with that knowledge, it doesn't make any difference. And the only thing we can do, really, is to recapture control of the system. You can write letters all you want to your congressman and to the bankers, and they laugh at you. Mm-hmm. They don't, the idea of the politicians who have been put into office because of the huge amounts of money that have been put at their disposal through the lobbying efforts of huge corporations and banks, and the influence that comes from control over the media and network endorsements and all of that sort of thing, that is so powerful compared to the little guy who votes. Especially when he aligns himself with the two major political parties and pretty much follows whatever his party leaders tell him to do. The voters really are out of this picture today. So the only thing we can do, instead of trying to write letters to your congressman and say, oh, please, won't you do what is right? Won't you please follow the Constitution? And they laugh at you. The only thing is to get in there and run for office and to start taking back the levers of power ourselves. You can't convert these guys. Most of them. There are some great exceptions, I might say. But on the average, the ones that are in office today are so thoroughly corrupted by the system that you are not going to change them. All you can do is replace them. And so this is a very important issue, I think, is how do we, who do not have an axe to grind, who really do want to follow the Constitution, how do we replace the people who are already in office? And that is a plan which is laid out by an organization that we created called Freedom Force International. And so anybody that really wants to get involved in doing something about it and becoming a real change agent, I urge them to come to that website. It's called freedomforceinternational.org. freedomforceinternational.org. And learn what it is we believe in, what is our code of conduct, what is our creed that we believe in, and then our strategy. How do we help each other become successful in recapturing control of the political systems of the nations in which we live? It's a big task, and it's not going to happen easily, and it's not going to happen quickly. It's not going to happen by November. Most people's time frame, their time frame is, well, who are you going to vote for in November? Like, that's the whole story. That's just one little piece of it. So anyway, if you really are interested in how we can turn this around, it might take a generation. It might even take 2 generations. But it can be done. And once you get the idea that it can be done, and in fact, it will be done. There's no question now in my mind. It's already started. You can't stop it. It will be done. And once you get that picture, it's very, very encouraging. So for those that want to become part of the solution, I invite them to come to the website called freedomforceinternational.org and learn all about it.
All right. Well, on that note, Ed, I want to thank you so much for your time today on Follow the Money Weekly Radio. Your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. Where's the best place for them to pick up a copy of this book, Ed?
Well, they're available in a lot of the bookstores, Amazon and all the rest, but the best place, we think, is to come to our website, which is realityzone.com. It's there, along with a lot of other products that are similar to it.
Fantastic. The book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, and my guest today, G. Edward Griffin. Ed, thank you so much for coming back to the program. I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
All right, thank you. It's been my pleasure.